Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 30 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. In the morning, Janir's wrist throbbed with a blunted pain, and the spirits of their company were no better. 3 knights had been killed in the skirmish and hastily buried before Armandius commanded them to move on. No graves for the bandits. Their bodies had been lain in a pile and burned. Saoven had spent a few hours early in the morning gathering up what horses they had lost, and now they rode at a much speedier pace than before. No one questioned Armandius when he ordered them to move faster. Karile urged his shaggy pony, that reached no higher than Kalbo's shoulder, to take up the place at the stallion's side. Since the attack, Armandius had decided against sending men to take the enchanter home. A letter had been sent to his father, along with a report to the High King. Marcerian would have to come and fetch his son himself when he could. "Remind me, where did you find that thing, Karile?" Janir nodded at his mount. "In the stables or the kennels?" She wasn't in an especially gracious mood this morning. Karile's pony resembled a sheepdog as much as it resembled a horse. With hair several inches long and hanging over the little animal's eyes, Janir wondered how and if the thing could see. A bulbous belly that might have been considered large on a warhorse hung suspended between the animal's stocky legs. Tiny black hooves peeked out from under the hairy fluff that almost matched Karile's shapeless robe. "Stop making fun of Agu," Karile snapped. "What kind of a name is that?" "I have no idea. I just made it up. It's fun to say. Agu. Agu." "You're mad," Janir mumbled, shaking her head. "You'll get me killed yet." "Nah, that's what wars are for. What did you think of those who attacked us last night?" Janir shrugged. She preferred not to think of it. "A little too well equipped to be simple misplaced trappers, wouldn't you say? Do you know anything about the Karile Road?" Janir squinted at the name. "There's an old folk tale that the Karile Road used to cut through the Gideon Mountains to connect Greenhaven and Saoven in ancient times. But I'm sure you knew that." "And?" Karile prompted. "I spent many summers hunting for it, but I never found it," Janir stiffly replied, still secretly a little disappointed. "I was going to spend this summer looking for it, but that plan was more or less ruined." "Don't you have better things to do during summer?" "No." Janir didn't actually have any close friends. Girls and other children she knew and sometimes had fun with, but not friends. She pressed on before he could ask questions. "Why all these sudden questions about the Karile Road? Do you think they have something to do with the Key of Amaton's buyer?" "No." Karile shook his head. "There were just some odd stories circulating among the valets about dwarves rebuilding the Karile Road." The enchanter shrugged. "Theoretically, the Slavish could use them to attack Brevia when and where we least expect it." "The valets?" Karile replied with conviction. "Oh, you'd be amazed what you can learn by talking to the blokes who clean the chamber pots." Janir had no doubt that servants heard far more than they were meant to, but Karile was another matter. "Really? What sort of things have you learned?" Karile was all too happy to oblige her in an elaboration, and Janir was quickly sorry that she had asked. It seemed that the Queen's most senior lady-in-waiting, a woman who had been her friend since childhood, had borrowed some of the Queen's gowns, and they had never been seen again. The captain of the guard had a gambling problem and was in debt to most of the thugs in Saradin. Lately, it was suspected that he had been leeching off the royal treasury. And then there was the issue of the High Steward sending biannual payments of silver to a priest in an obscure parish. "We know that whatever it is would be enough to send him into exile for life or worse, though no one's quite sure what it is." Karile wiggled his eyebrows. it does make the imagination flutter, does it not? The enchanter went tossing around suppositions and allegations as if they were no more than dirty stockings, not seeming in the least concerned they might be overheard. Armandius and Saoven were preoccupied. The knights had never noticed them in the first place. The ladies had tired of them, save for Gwenna, who was still more than a little shaken. At least everyone ignored them for now. "Have you tried to find out how many of these tales are actually true?" Janir skeptically challenged. "Have you tried to find out how many of these tales are actually true?" Janir skeptically challenged. "Oh, certainly." Karile was only too happy at her question. "They're all true. My secret sources confirmed it." The enchanter winked conspiratorially. "Your secret sources?" Janir was becoming weary with the enchanter's exaggerations. "Yep." "And who might these secret sources be?" "Well, if I told you, they wouldn't be secret, would they?" Karile smugly retorted. "Assuming these accusations are true, why would you be telling me?" The enchanter shrugged. "Why not? It's fun to talk trash about people in high places." Going back to the Kryden Road. "Oh yes, let's." "It would have to pass through the farthest and highest reaches of the Gideon mountain ranges, right?" "Yes." Karile nodded. "Well, then what about frost griffins? Don't they nest there?" Karile was contemplative for a few moments. "They do, don't they? Well, I guess that means that the enemy will only be able to travel in broad daylight. Yet another advantage for us." They reached home uneventfully a week later around dusk. Dame Salila demanded where Janir had been, along with a plethora of other uncomfortable questions. Armandius had written to assure everyone that Janir was safe, but he had been rather sparing on the details. The girl vaguely and rather awkwardly replied that she had been on a tour of the country. That didn't explain her hasty departure, but the faithful old Baroness was then too preoccupied helping Brophy, the head steward, to ask. While the two of them situated and saw to the housing of the Queen's party, Janir made her way up to her private chambers. Eventually, Janir would have to explain herself, and it was not a conversation she was looking forward to. Even without an official title, the dame oversaw the domestic workings of the castle. She was not one to be easily dissuaded. Perhaps Janir should just tell Dame Salila to ask Armandius. From her window, the valley spread out before her. The comfortingly familiar fields and grazing sheep were more welcoming than any home fire could have been. Just as she was about to slip under the covers of her bed, there came a knock at the door. Letting off a groan, Janir threw on her dressing gown before answering. As she had suspected, it was Karile on the other side. She blinked at him with incredulity. "Karile, we've been traveling for 2 weeks. Aren't you tired?" "Evil wearies not, so we must not lower our guard." "Did you swallow a book of purple prose?" she snapped. "Do you even know what you just said?" The enchanter shrugged. "I came to ask you a favor." "No." Janir slammed the door in his face. Karile was undeterred. "Oh, come on. I just wanted you to take me riding with you tomorrow." "Really? And what else?" Janir pressed, still not opening the door. "Open the door and I'll tell you." "Tell me and maybe I'll open the door." "Nope. Open the door or you'll never know." "That is perfectly fine with me." "All right. I want to go looking for the Kryden Road with you. Please," he pleaded. Janir sighed, closed her eyes, and rested her forehead on the door. So the enchanter was at it again. Months of misfortune and misadventures flashed before her eyes as she recalled what had happened the last time she had been dragged along on one of his searches. Just as she was about to tell him to shove off, she realized that letting him run loose in Greenhaven might not be the wisest course of action. Armandius had sent that message to Karile's father. All the same, with travel time and the war, it could be weeks or months before anyone came to collect him. An idea came to Janir. She'd often gone riding for hours on end, and it was an excellent way to avoid seeing anyone who would want an explanation. of any kind. Janir ever so slowly opened the door to Karile's beseeching face. The snows could come literally any moment. All the more reason for us to hurry. Hope flashed across his face. Fine, she sighed. I'll take you in the morning. But don't expect to find anything. I told you that I've been looking for years. Karile lit up like a bonfire. Yes, but you see, you know where it isn't. I'd say our work's half done. Judging by past experience, this is just the beginning, Janir muttered as Karile skipped down the hall and disappeared. Janir awoke early the next morning. Jumping out of bed, she threw on her linen dressing gown and tossed aside the curtains, just as she had done every morning for so many years. Below, the courtyard was coming to life. Everything was so very much the same. She dressed in her winter riding habit, packed away in a trunk in the back of her wardrobe. It was made of a heavier and warmer fabric than the one she normally wore, perfect for late autumn riding. She hastily scrawled a note on her nightstand, explaining where she was off to, and then she was ready. About to go out the door, she stopped. Janir's eyes wandered to the place behind the drapes, where she had hidden her carcatan. She wanted to bring them, but carrying them around would increase the chances of them being noticed by some unsuspecting stable hand or curious child, and then there would be a new slew of problems. Leaving her carcatan behind, she made her way to the ground level of the castle. With a bun hastily pilfered from the kitchens, she navigated the sturdy shops and homes of the craftsmen and castle workers. Most had dwelt on the grounds for generations. As she passed the front of the blacksmith's house, she glimpsed a man on an overturned bucket, cradling a gurgling baby in his arms. "Good morning, Janir." Saoven smiled, glancing up from the babe in his lap. "Good morning. And who is this?" Janir motioned to the cooing child swathed in a lamb's wool blanket. The baby might have been around 6 months old, with pale ringlets beginning to form on his round head. The infant was gumming on his plump arms and fingers, still in the process of exploring his own limbs. "This is the little Heimhergsif," the elf explained, raising the child so Janir could see the baby's light blue eyes and happy smile. "His mother is explaining the dangers of playing in bullpens to his older brothers. I was doing nothing particularly pressing at the moment." Janir turned over another empty bucket and sat down. Karile would find her eventually. "He's adorable." The girl tilted her head sideways and watched the infant knead his tiny hands together. "He reminds me of my own nephew back home," Saoven said fondly. "You have a nephew, too?" Janir probed. "Well, yes," Saoven faltered. "My brother's son." It struck Janir afresh how long she had been friends with Saoven, and yet how little she knew of him. Then it occurred to her that Velasquez was a grandfather. For some reason, that was funny. Saoven shifted the small bundle of cooing baby in his arms. He had done this before. "My brother may not share mine and our pater's fondness for mortals, but I must say that he's a good father." "I think you would be too." Saoven raised his eyes to her, and she looked at him. Really looked at him. He was a little under average height for a man, with eyes like a forest creature's that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings at a glance. He was built like a young stag, long-limbed and strong but lean. Unlike most elves, his dark chestnut hair had been shorn so that it hung just over his tapered ears. His expression was naturally soft, and his angular face had always seemed ready to broaden into a smile. Janir realized what she had said and coughed awkwardly. She probably sounded like a silly child to him. "Hey!" Karile's voice screeched from behind her. "Have you forgotten our deal?" "I'm sorry," Janir apologized, studying the ground. "I agreed to take Karile riding this morning." "He certainly will not allow you to forget it." The elf glanced past her. "Out riding? When we've just arrived?" Janir shrugged. It just seemed like a good way to avoid uncomfortable questions around here. "By riding off alone with a boy." Janir choked. "Nope, it isn't like that. I don't even think that way. Not about him, I mean, but..." The corners of Saoven's mouth curled just enough, she noticed. Janir ducked her head and ran away before she made an even bigger fool of herself. She followed his gaze and saw Karile standing at the entrance of the horse stables, waving two stirrups wildly in the air. Rolling her eyes, Janir marched to where Karile flailed like some demented juggler. When he saw that she was coming, he retreated inside the stables and re-emerged, leading a saddled dun mare with a black mane. Karile dusted stray strands of straw off his robe with one hand, while holding the mare's reins with the other. "The head groom says this is the horse you usually ride when Kalbo's out of commission." "Fauna. She and Kalbo had the same sire," Janir said, more to herself than to the enchanter, who was flapping his cloth abyss of a garment. She took the reins from Karile before the dun spooked. "Aren't you going to get your own horse? I know we have a few ponies in there." She kept her back facing squarely in the direction of Saoven. "No, I'd rather ride with you," Karile responded. "Harder to get lost that way." "But not impossible," Janir muttered. "I assume you want to set out now?" "Well, sure. No sense in wasting daylight when there's adventure to be had." Janir gathered up the mare's reins, slipped one foot into the near stirrup, and swung onto the horse's back before reaching an arm for Karile, though he hardly needed it. The enchanter sprang up behind her with the grace and swiftness of a deer. Why couldn't he always be that coordinated? Janir nudged Fauna into a steady walk while the mare adjusted to having Karile on board. Once she seemed comfortable, they loped out the gates and broke toward the forests and mountains beside the castle. Janir guided their mount between the neat plots of land covering the fields. Every one of the plots was tilled over and barren in preparation for the oncoming winter and the planting season in spring. Contrary to Armandius's expectations, they had missed the harvest celebrations by over a week. The farmsteads beside the fields were repaired and hunkered down, ready for the snow and ice that winter would bring. They passed a few yeomen and yeomen's wives from the farmsteads. Most of them raised a hand in greeting, which Karile enthusiastically returned, waving until Janir made him stop for fear that his fluttering would frighten the horse again. It wasn't long before they reached the foothills of the Gideon Mountains and were ascending up the slopes between the trees. "You know, it's odd that even when trees are growing on the side of a hill, they grow straight up. Fascinating, isn't it?" Karile mused. Janir didn't care at the moment. "What do you want to see?" she asked. "Tell me where I should be taking you." The enchanter considered it. "Anywhere the land is lower than it normally would be, or where there are lots and lots of rocks. Preferably both." Janir knew of at least a dozen places in these woods matching one or both of those descriptions. She turned Fauna toward the nearest one and resigned herself to a very long day. As she thought about it, she should have asked Armandius before riding off like this with the enchanter, but this was Karile. And if she was honest with herself, this would put off her explanation to Dame Salila and the others at the castle. Hopefully, Saoven would forget about her stammering by the next time they spoke. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.